Ben, good question from Kieran.
Yeah, great question from Kieran. There's a couple of ways to try and interpret this question. So I'm gonna there's a word in here. So should I purchase these units or small complex? So it's not necessarily build. Now, if you are thinking about being an active or a passive investor, so this is the story here, right? Passive investing or active worker. So I think he's a good human with his endeavours and his pursuit in terms of providing essential accommodation and potentially in some cases maybe even more affordable rental accommodation. Sounds like a good human. In terms of how I would approach this, it's really simple. I look at this and say, well, what is my capacity, my skill, my abilities to run a project? Let's say I'm actually building this from the ground. So I need to secure a site of land. It might have an existing house on it. I potentially turn those into a group of townhouses or apartments or whatever that might be. So that's turning apple into apple pie. That is a very, very profitable pursuit, but it comes with risk. So we think about margin of safety. So I'm not a builder. I'm not a licensed builder. Sounds like Kieran's not. So what if the builder goes broke? What if, all of those other problems? What if my funding line gets pulled, like we've heard horror stories of recently? So all of those things but the return is definitely greater. Turning apples into apple pie is definitely a greater return. There's no doubt about that, but it's not passive investing. It's actually starting a business of property development and going through and building that development. Don't ever lose sight of that. The reward should be better because the risk is greater. But you can tell me about these 750 square meter blocks that I can just have the existing properties, two of them, and then let them do that, and I can do passive investing. I'm not going to help as many people, and eventually I can also, down the track in the next decade or two, I could also turn those into townhouses or at least semi-detached homes. So I can still ultimately do that in terms of increasing its productive use down the track, but I can also have them now as a passive investment. And so that is ultimately the conversation that's running through my head. We don't know the scenario. We don't know what states or territories that he's looking to do this in, but they are the fundamental things. Make no mistake, turning apple into apple pie is a greater risk and it should deliver a greater return because you're taking on that greater risk, as opposed to having a passive investment that maybe down the track you would potentially look at doing something.
Ben, I'm going to have a slightly different angle on this question just to give some variety here. I'm going to assume that I've read that this particular investor is they're still in the accumulation phase. I'm going to assume that they, and I think there's mixed intentions here, and I think the intentions are admirable. I've interpreted that number one, wants to help other people, right? Beautiful. Immigrant kids, divorcees, other people in some form of marginalisation is what I interpreted the original part of the question. So Kieran, triple tick for that, mate. You've obviously got a heart for people, which is brilliant. I think it's at a mixed purpose with return on investment too, because to be out in the best position to serve other people comes from your excess. So if you're in a position to have excess and additional wealth, from the overflow of that, you then get to seed that into other people. So I'm going to take the assumption from this question that Kieran's still in the accumulation phase. I'm assuming there's no big lump sum cash here that allows him to just benevolently buy properties and then be able to put them into the marketplace to those marginalised people. And I just want to remind everyone that there's three phases. You go through accumulation, then you go through reducing LVR, then you go into lifestyle by design, right? So the accumulation here is I need to buy the best properties that are going to get me the best return. They're going to enable me to get to the North Star that I'm after in a way that is commercial. Like we've always been talking about property investing being a small business game. It's a bit like saying, I'm going to open a small business, but I'm going to offer my product to a marginalised part of the community at reduced terms, rates, prices, whatever that is, which is great. But if you can't keep the lights on because that small business is not turning over enough or getting the return on the investment for you to stay in business, that's where the mixed intentions clash. So again, the heart to help people is a beautiful thing. So what I'd probably say here is houses has historically performed better than units. right? And going forward, that's most likely to still be the case. So if you're in that accumulation phase and you can continue to build your wealth through having increased capital growth, because the reason we say capital growth first is because you want to build the wealth base large enough so that you can attract a rental income pool large enough that over time reduces your LVR. And once that LVR has been reduced, you then have this surplus to play with. Um, so that's why I've taken the assumption here that it's not a big cash game, because if you have a big cash reserve and the funding isn't the big issue, well then revert back to what Ben said, because the yield that comes from getting a higher yield on the land returns more cash flow back for you. Because in a perfect world, we'd all buy a block of units if we didn't have any debt involved in it, Ben, because we're getting a higher yield, get more cash flow. And the game is to eventually get to the end of the portfolio where you've got a portfolio that's spinning off cash. But there's a journey to actually get there. There's a journey of accumulation. There's a journey of retiring out the debt. And then the journey at the end is actually to enjoy what's happening. If you can cut those first two parts out, great, go for the units, because you probably don't need the growth because you're actually chasing the income anyway. So there's so many layers to this question. But if I go back to my original perspective from which I interpret this question, I think I would largely be chasing the houses, for all the reasons that we've talked about in the past. But therefore, we can move through those stages faster. And then if we can move through those stages faster, we talk about $2,000 a week, Kieran, as being your own home paid off, maybe two or three investment properties, combine it with super. Well, if you're determined and action oriented like you are in this question, you might be able to get to a position where you get your family's needs sorted ASAP, which then means you can leverage and take on more. You might have 4 properties, 5 properties. You might even want to go 10 properties, largely because once the foundation is set, the next part of your goal is to build wealth to throw back to other people in the community and add value to those other people in the community. So therefore, without better understanding what the debt coverage is in this question, what's better understanding what your goal is and the resources you have, all things being equal, my interpretation of the question is, um, I would go for the higher land component with the houses because we'll chase the growth, but it will come at the expense of yield, as you pointed out in your question.
Well said, mate. I mean, I like the idea. I think about the 7 grades, that we talk about financial well-being. So if he is in that accumulation phase, which we call control, then we've got obviously financial peace, and then we've got contribution. So yeah, Kieran, if you're in the contribution phase, to Bryce's point, then and you've got that luxury, you could still start with, as I said, productive use. So if you're purchasing it, you're paying a premium for the builder slash developer, right? They've got their margin in there, whatever that might be, anything from say 15 to 30% profit margin in that build. If you could do that and manage that process, that goes into your coffers. So that's you turning the land from and increasing its productive use, which is then allowing you to put multiple income producing assets on it, but you still control the whole lot. So that's where, in terms of the interpretation and us not knowing the full story here, Bryce has done a great job of explaining the assumption of the accumulation phase and the boring approach that we take as passive investors. And that's how we guide most of our clients. But then there's also a hands-on approach here that may be plausible to you based on no debt or also wanting to be an active developer or a small-time developer to do that work. And that's why the decisions would be different based on those circumstances.